It all started with one of those calls that come at the worst possible moment. You know, when you're chopping vegetables or in the middle of an important part of a game. I was lying on the couch, half watching a crime documentary, when the phone vibrated on the table. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. Nothing unusual, except for the fact that she should have been at work, finishing an important presentation for a client. Intrigued as to why she was calling during work hours, I thought it might be something ordinary, maybe a quick conversation or a funny story. But when I answered, her voice was tense, almost robotic, as if she were reading from a script. "Hi, Richard. We need to talk." Those words immediately triggered alarm. The last time she said them, it led to months of couples therapy after she accused me of being emotionally unavailable or something like that. But this time was different. Her voice trembled and there was fear in it, something she couldn't hide. A wave of anxiety crept over me. "All right, then talk," I said, now fully alert and sitting up straight. "Not over the phone," she replied, her breathing uneven, almost panicked. I could hear her struggling to stay calm. What was going on? Before I could ask, she hung up. Just like that. The hours after that were agonizing. My mind raced through 100 different scenarios, none of them good. But no matter what I imagined, it couldn't have prepared me for what happened later that evening. When Sarah walked through the door, she wasn't alone. Behind her was a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his early 40s, wearing a suit that seemed outdated. Sarah avoided making eye contact with me, and the man stood there nervously shifting his weight, as if he wanted to disappear. My heart raced, and I asked, "Who is this?" Before he could answer, Sarah interrupted. For the first time, she looked me directly in the eyes, her face emotionless, frighteningly calm. "This is Joseph," she said. "He's the one I've been seeing." It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me, the air suddenly thick and suffocating. Her words were devoid of emotion, spoken with such detachment that it made them even more painful. My first instinct was to laugh, thinking it was some kind of strange joke. But it wasn't. Joseph stared at the floor, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, while Sarah stood motionless, her face cold and unreadable. "What? Wait, what?" The words barely left my lips, my mind reeling from the shock, anger, and disbelief all at once. She didn't flinch. "We've been seeing each other for almost 2 years," she continued, each word sounding rehearsed, as if she'd played this moment out in her head many times. "And I think I love him." As soon as those words left her lips, everything inside me twisted. I felt a rage, not just at her, but at myself. How could I have been so blind? Late nights at work, new friends, sudden attention to her appearance. All the signs were there, and I ignored every single one. Joseph finally looked up, and what I saw in his eyes sent a surge of fury through me. It wasn't guilt. It was pity. He pitied me. "Get the hell out of my house!" I barked, taking a step toward him, my fists clenched. Joseph stepped back, frightened as if he were about to run. But before he could, Sarah stepped between us, her gaze sharp, ready for a fight. "Stop, Richard. Losing it won't change anything." She glanced at Joseph, then back at me, her voice steady. "He's staying. We need to talk." Staying? I could barely contain the rage boiling inside me. My vision blurred, and I felt the anger consuming every fiber of my being. A storm of rage rose within me, threatening to explode at any moment. The situation felt surreal. "You bring your lover into our home and now he's staying here?" My hand trembled as I pointed at Joseph, trying to contain my fury. "Get out or I swear!" Before I could finish, Sarah stepped forward, pressing her hand against my chest. Not with love, but with clear intent to hold me back, as if I were a beast that needed taming. Her voice was eerily calm, steady, sending a chill down my spine. "You're not in charge here, Richard." That phrase hit me harder than any physical blow. In that moment, everything changed. The woman I thought I knew revealed a side of herself I could have never predicted. Cold, calculating, and utterly indifferent to me. Sensing the rising tension, Joseph mumbled something about waiting outside and quickly left the room without another word. Now it was just the two of us, Sarah and me, standing amidst the wreckage of what had just collapsed. "Why?" was all I could manage to say, my voice barely audible. She sighed, running her fingers through her hair, still avoiding my eyes. "Do you really want to hear this? Because this, us, stopped being enough for me a long time ago. Joseph, he's what I need now." Each word felt like a stab, each one cutting deeper than the last, paralyzing me where I stood. Her tone was distant, cold, final. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Every instinct screamed at me. Shout, unleash the anger, rewind time and erase this nightmare. But all I could do was stand there, staring at the woman who now seemed like a stranger to me. "How long?" I croaked, my voice shaking. "How long have you been with him?" I needed something, anything, to make sense of the world that was falling apart before me. Sarah rolled her eyes, as if the entire conversation was trivial to her, and my pain merely a minor inconvenience. "I already told you about 2 years," she said, her voice tinged with irritation. "Can we not do this right now, Richard? You asked," I answered. "It's over." 2 whole years. That meant everything. Our trip to rekindle our relationship, the evenings I cooked her favorite meals, the quiet nights spent trying to reconnect, had been a lie. While I was making plans for our happy retirement, she was with him. It felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer and shattered 40 years of my life into tiny pieces. Something inside me broke. This was no longer just anger. It was wild, untamed fury that couldn't be contained. My hand lashed out, knocking a vase off the kitchen counter. It crashed to the floor, shattering into fragments. Sarah flinched, and for a split second I thought I saw fear on her face, but it quickly shifted back to that cold, indifferent mask. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice void of emotion, her gaze locked onto mine. She stepped over the broken glass as if it were nothing, as if the destruction around her was just another inconvenience to endure. "No, Sarah, I'm not done." The venom in my voice was unmistakable. "You bring him into our home, tell me you love him, and you expect me to just, what, accept it? Let him stay here while we have a civilized conversation?" The words dripped with bitterness, but Sarah's expression didn't change. She was already gone, miles away from me, from us. I let out a sharp, joyless laugh. "Who even does something like this? What could have happened to you?" She shook her head almost sympathetically, as if I was missing something obvious. "You really don't get it, do you? I came to you today because I wanted you to hear it from me first, before the truth comes out. Joseph's wife knows. That's why I had to bring him here." The mention of Joseph's wife left a bitter taste in my mouth. He was married. The situation was spiraling out of control, becoming darker than I could have ever imagined. Every new detail made me feel worse. "So, you're not even his woman? You're both ruining 2 marriages? Why, Sarah? For some cheap thrill?" She crossed her arms, her face hardened, lips tightly pressed together. "Don't try to make me the villain here. You were never there, Richard. You were always absorbed in your work, lost in your own world. I needed something more, something you weren't giving me. Joseph understands me in a way you never did. And yes, he's married, or was. That's going to change soon." "This isn't just a meaningless fling," she added, but I took a step back, feeling my heart pounding furiously. Anger quickly mixed with something colder, heavier. "So this is what it's come to," I said. "You're running away just because things got hard, because reality finally caught up with you." Sarah laughed, but it wasn't the warm, familiar laugh that used to brighten our evenings. This laugh was hollow, almost mocking. "Maybe I am running, or maybe I just realized that I deserve happiness. And you know what? I regret nothing." Her words hit me hard. There wasn't a shred of guilt, not a trace of remorse. It became painfully clear. Sarah didn't feel guilty. She wasn't going to apologize or try to fix anything. In her mind, she was right. and I was the fool who couldn't see it. At that moment, the front door creaked, and Joseph walked in. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. Broken vase on the floor, tension thick in the air. He looked at Sarah, then at me, his voice barely audible. "Is this a bad time?" Sarah turned to him, and in that instant it was as if I ceased to exist. Her face softened, her eyes filled with warmth as she looked at him, a look I hadn't seen directed at me in years. "No," she said quietly. "It's fine." She walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder as if they were already a couple, as if they shared a reality in which there was no longer any place for me. Something inside me broke. Watching her touch him like that, in my own home, among the remnants of our life together, it wasn't just betrayal. It felt as if she was erasing everything we had, rewriting the history of our relationship while I stood there, clutching the torn pieces of our memories. I grabbed the keys off the table, the cold metal digging into my palm as I turned toward the door. I couldn't stay another second. "I'm leaving," I said, barely holding my voice together. "And when I come back, I want both of you gone. Do you hear me, Sarah? I want you out of my house." She didn't respond. She kept looking at Joseph, as if he were the only person that mattered. And that, more than anything else, was the final confirmation for me. I slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. I was completely lost, unsure of where I was heading. There was no direction, only the certainty that something had ended. Us, the version of myself that I thought I was. And maybe somewhere in this chaos there was a hidden new beginning, a chapter where I could finally see her for who she really was. That night I drove aimlessly for hours, the road stretching endlessly before me, illuminated only by my headlights. The low rumble of the engine was the only sound piercing through the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. I had no destination, no plan. I couldn't even fully grasp what had just happened. Sarah's words echoed in my mind, her coldness. Joseph standing in my house. It played over and over again in my head, a relentless cycle that wouldn't stop. At some point, I found myself in an abandoned parking lot on the edge of town, near a row of closed shops and a solitary, non-functioning diner. I stopped, turned off the car, and sat in the thick silence. The night pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. I had held back the growing storm of emotions for hours, but now, sitting alone in this stillness, the dam burst. The tears came suddenly, burning, streaming down my face as I pounded my fists against the steering wheel. How could she do this to me? How could she look at me with those eyes? The same eyes that had once been full of warmth, love, and devotion, but now, empty, devoid of any feeling. They told me I was nothing to her anymore, that everything we had was nothing but a cruel illusion. I screamed, a wild, primal scream, but the car windows muffled it, not that it mattered. There was no one around to hear me. My phone vibrated on the seat beside me, the screen lighting up with a new notification. I glanced at it, expecting some pointless alert to ignore, but froze when I saw the name. It wasn't spam. It was a message from Margaret, Sarah's closest friend. Margaret, the one who had called me just a day ago. Her voice had been hesitant, as if she were hiding something, something important she couldn't say at the time. "Richard, we need to talk. I know about Joseph. Please call me." My heart raced as I stared at the message, the words blurring before my eyes. Without thinking, I dialed her number. My fingers trembled as I pressed the call button, and after a few rings, Margaret answered. "Richard," she whispered, her voice a mix of relief and uncertainty. "I didn't think you'd actually call." "Margaret, what's going on?" I asked bluntly, my voice rough. "You called me yesterday. You knew about Joseph. You knew something. Tell me the truth." There was a long, heavy pause, and I could almost feel her inner turmoil on the other end. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet, as if revealing a secret she didn't want to share. Sarah has been lying to you, Richard. I didn't want to get involved, but I can't stay silent anymore. She's not just seeing Joseph. She's been planning to leave you for months. She's been waiting for the right moment for everything to fall into place. My heart pounded in my ears. Her words hit me like a cold shower. What was she waiting for? I asked, disbelieving despite my exhaustion. For Joseph to leave his wife, she replied, her voice trembling. Sarah wanted to make sure he was serious before destroying your life, but, Richard, it's worse. She fell silent, and I heard her swallow hard, her hesitation palpable. And then it all clicked. The reason Margaret had called. Sarah cheated on you 10 years ago. This wasn't the first time Sarah had done something like this. My body tensed, and my grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. What do you mean? I muttered with difficulty, my voice barely audible. 10 years ago, Sarah had an affair with another married man, Margaret said, her words laced with pain. His wife came to me devastated. Back then I dismissed it as baseless rumors, but now seeing her with Joseph, watching her behavior, everything is falling into place. Margaret's voice trembled, as if even she struggled to accept the truth she was revealing. Richard. She hasn't changed. She's just found someone new. A cold, dull numbness began to spread through my body, from my chest to the tips of my fingers. 10 years. That's when I first felt something was wrong in our relationship. Back then, I shrugged it off, attributing everything to work stress, the pressures of life, any excuse that allowed me to ignore the warning signs. I never would have thought that Sarah was hiding something so dark and treacherous. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I finally managed to force out, my voice rasping, betraying me. Because, Richard, Margaret responded with heavy regret in her voice, Sarah is my friend. I wanted to believe she had changed. I hoped what you two had was real, that she had outgrown her old habits. But I can't stay silent anymore, not after what I've seen. You deserve the truth. I didn't say another word. I hung up, and the phone slipped from my hand, landing on the seat beside me. 10 years of lies, manipulation, all while she continued her game behind my back. And Joseph? He was just the latest in a long line, far from the first. The air in the car felt suffocating, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I flung open the door and stepped out into the cold night, desperate for relief, for any feeling that could displace the crushing weight of betrayal. Above me, the stars shone brightly, indifferent to the chaos inside me. I stared at them, wondering, how much more had Sarah hidden from me? How much of my life had been a lie? And then something changed inside me. The bitterness, the anger, the sense of betrayal. It all crystallized into something sharp, focused. I wasn't going to let her keep deceiving me. I refused to remain a fool in her twisted game. Grabbing my phone again, I scrolled through my contacts with a determination I hadn't felt in hours. I needed a conversation. But not with Margaret, not with a therapist, not with anyone who would try to soothe my wounds. I needed the truth from someone who had lived through this with me. Joseph's wife. After a few rings, a tired, fragile voice answered on the other end. Hello? Hi. This is Richard, Sarah's husband. We need to talk. There was a long pause, followed by a deep, exhausted sigh, full of a pain that couldn't be expressed in words. Yes, she replied quietly. We do. The next day I met Joseph's wife at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Her name was Olivia. On the way there, I had imagined this meeting 100 times. How she would react, what she would say, how we would even begin such a conversation. But when I finally saw her, reality hit harder than any of my assumptions. Olivia sat by the window, a nearly untouched cup of coffee in front of her, staring blankly out at the street. She looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept for days, her skin pale, her eyes red and swollen. When she noticed me, Her hand lifted in a gesture that seemed more like a reflex than anything deliberate, and I approached her table, feeling the same uneasy mixture of fear and resolve that had gnawed at me since last night. "Richard?" Her voice was barely audible as I approached the table. "Yes," I replied, sitting down across from her. I forced myself to smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Thank you for coming," I added. Olivia gave a slight nod, her hands gripping the coffee cup in front of her tightly. The silence between us was oppressive, almost suffocating. We were both fully aware of the unspoken tension, the shared pain from the betrayal that had shattered our lives. I was trying to find the right words. What can you say to someone whose life was broken by the same person who destroyed yours? In the end, Olivia broke the silence. "When I found out about Joseph and Sarah," she began, her voice trembling, "I felt like I was going insane. I kept trying to convince myself it couldn't be true, that there had to be some other explanation. But the truth always comes out, doesn't it?" I nodded, swallowing hard, trying to figure out how to respond. "Yes," was all I could manage to say. I took a deep breath, deciding to cut straight to the point. "Margaret told me about Sarah's past, about what happened with that other married man 10 years ago. I had no idea." Olivia looked into my eyes, as if searching for something. Then, she let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "I wish I could say that surprised me, Richard, but when I found out about Sarah, I realized she'd done it before. The way Joseph talked about her, the way she acted, it was like she had perfected her craft. She knew exactly how to play on his emotions, how to make him believe she was his path to salvation." Her voice trembled, and she looked down at the table, pain etched in every feature of her face. "Joseph thought she was special. He said she understood him in ways I no longer could. I wonder if he ever realized what he was giving up for a woman who was only toying with him." My jaw clenched as a familiar anger stirred inside me, reminding me how easily Sarah had dismissed our relationship, as if it were just another move in her game. "She did the same thing to me," I said quietly, my voice tight. "She brought Joseph to our home. Right there, she told me she thought she loved him, as if it meant nothing." Olivia's eyes widened, her face going pale with shock. "She brought him to your home?" she repeated, horrified. I nodded, feeling that cold fury rise within me again. "Yes," I confirmed. "She made me stand there and watch as she flaunted him, as if he were some kind of prize. I'll never forget the look in her eyes, like I was nothing to her, something that could just be thrown away." Olivia closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "I'm so sorry, Richard. No one deserves that. Not you, not anyone." We sat in the silence that followed her words, and the magnitude of our shared betrayal bound us together more than any words could. In that moment, I saw her pain more clearly than ever before, and I realized we weren't alone. We had both been used, deceived, and discarded by the very people who had destroyed our lives. "Do you know what you're going to do?" Olivia asked quietly after a long pause. I shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me just wants to burn everything to the ground. Part of me just wants to walk away from all of this and never come back. I'm still trying to figure everything out." Olivia nodded slowly and sympathetically. "I know exactly what you're going through." The thought of leaving Joseph crossed my mind the moment the truth came out. But now all that's left is this dull emptiness. I don't even know if I have the strength to keep fighting. He's trying to fix things, making promises, but they just feel so empty now. The idea that Sarah would apologize seems absurd. I can only imagine her rolling her eyes in disdain at the mere thought of regret. Sarah didn't even pretend to be sorry. She acted as if I was to blame, I said, bitterness seeping into my voice, as if I was the reason she had to turn to someone else. Olivia nodded again, her eyes falling to the ground. "That's what they do, isn't it? They twist everything, making us feel like we pushed them to it, like it's our fault. But it's not. It was their choice." She lifted her head, and a sudden sharp clarity appeared in her eyes. In that moment, I realized she wasn't as fragile as I had thought. It's not our fault, Richard. They did this to us, and we can't let them take anything more from us. Her words ignited something in me, a flicker of strength I hadn't felt in days. She was right. I wasn't the one to blame. I wasn't the one who lied and betrayed our trust. That was Sarah and Joseph. They made their decisions, and now they would have to face the consequences. I took a deep breath and nodded. You're right. We deserve better. We deserve people who truly care, who won't lie to our faces, I said. Olivia gave a sad but hopeful smile. Yes, we really do. And maybe one day we'll find that. We talked a little longer, sharing stories, venting our pain and disappointment. By the end of the conversation, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: relief. Olivia understood me in a way no one else could. She had been through the same storm, the same betrayal. Talking to her made me feel a little less alone. When I stood up to leave, I looked back at her. For the first time, I felt something close to hope. Thank you, Olivia, for coming, for listening. She nodded, her eyes still tinged with sadness, but now filled with a strength and resolve that hadn't been there before. We're in this together, Richard. We'll get through it, one way or another. As I walked out of the cafe, the cold air hit my face, sharp and piercing, but I welcomed it. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Sarah may have shattered my world, but I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. As I headed to my car, one thing became crystal clear. I was no longer a victim. It was time to take control of my life, to decide my future, and finally let go of the woman who had shown me just how little I meant to her. When I returned home that evening, a plan was already forming in my mind. I couldn't let Sarah walk away unpunished and still keep my pride intact. She made her choice, and now it was my turn. Joseph appearing before me, as if everything Sarah and I had built together had never existed, thinking he could walk away without consequences. That was her mistake. She thought I would remain broken, but I had other plans. As I entered the house, the weight of what I was about to do began pressing on me. The house was eerily quiet, and for a moment, I thought she might have taken my words seriously and left. But then, I heard the faint sound of conversation coming from the living room. It was their voices, hers and his, whispering like teenagers caught doing something forbidden. Rage flared inside me, and I headed toward the living room, their words growing clearer with each step. I could hear Sarah trying to calm Joseph, her voice soft and soothing. Don't worry, Joseph, he's just upset. He'll cool off soon, he always does. Her words cut me deeper than she could have imagined. She thought she knew me, believed I would always come crawling back for the crumbs of her attention, even after everything she had done to me. But she underestimated me. I flung the door open with force, and they both whipped their heads toward me. For a brief moment, surprise flickered in Sarah's eyes, but it quickly faded, replaced by her usual defiance. Joseph, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to disappear, awkwardly standing beside her. Richard, Sarah said, irritation evident in her voice. You're home already? I didn't respond to her. My focus was entirely on Joseph. You need to leave, I said, my voice calm but with a steel edge that left no room for argument. Joseph glanced at Sarah, hoping for her support, but received none. Mumbling some excuse, he hurried out of the room, the slam of the front door leaving just the two of us. Now it was just Sarah and me, standing in what was once a place filled with happiness and comfort. Evenings spent playing games, lazy weekends, those seemed like a lifetime ago. The living room, once our cozy corner, had become a battlefield. Seriously, Richard? Sarah crossed her arms, her voice full of irritation. Is this how you're going to act? You said you were leaving. I took a step forward, my gaze never leaving hers. Do you really think you can bring him into my home and expect me to just leave? Do you think I'm going to let you rewrite our story, turning me into the villain? No, Sarah. You won't get away with this so easily." She rolled her eyes, her face twisting with disdain. "What are you even talking about, Richard? It's over between us. I've left. Joseph and I—" "Joseph and you?" I interrupted, my voice quiet but controlled. "He's a coward, and you keep making the same mistake over and over. Margaret told me about your affair 10 years ago, with the married man you were seeing back then. You've done this before, Sarah. You're not some victim looking for something more. You're a liar, and you destroy lives just to feel in control." For the first time, surprise flashed across her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words never came. I wasn't going to give her the chance to justify herself. I pressed on, determined to finish what I had started, without giving her an opening to respond. "Don't put this on me," I said, feeling my voice begin to tremble with irritation. "You can't just stand there and pretend like I forced you into this. Every decision was yours, Sarah. You chose to lie, to hide, and to bring that man into our home." She had set this all in motion herself, but now she lacked the courage to take responsibility. Her face flushed with anger, and she snapped back. "Do you think you're perfect, Richard? As if you were the ideal husband? You were distant, always buried in work. I never felt wanted." I let out a bitter chuckle, shaking my head in disbelief. "And instead of talking to me, trying to fix this like an adult, you did what you always do. You ran. You found someone else to fill the void." I leaned in closer, and though my voice became calmer, it cut through the tension like a blade. "But here's the truth, Sarah. It won't bring you happiness. You'll keep running, keep lying, and you'll never find what you're looking for. You'll die alone when he finds someone younger." Her eyes widened, and though she opened her mouth to argue, no words came. For a moment, the anger in her eyes faded, replaced by something else. Fear? "You're wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Joseph loves me. He understands me." "No, Sarah," I said, stepping even closer, softening my tone though it still carried an edge. "Joseph knows the version of you that craves drama and wants to be saved. But he doesn't know the real you, and deep down, you know it too." Her gaze dropped to the floor, her arms hanging limply by her sides. She seemed smaller, almost fragile, as if the weight of her choices had finally caught up to her. I exhaled slowly, feeling an unexpected calm wash over me. I had said everything I needed to, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of release. This was no longer my burden. It was hers now. "I want you to leave the house, Sarah," I said quietly but firmly. "Take whatever you need, but by tomorrow you won't be here. I'll call the lawyer. We're done." She met my gaze, and something flickered in her eyes that I couldn't quite read. Fear, regret, perhaps even a hint of realization. But it no longer mattered. Whatever she felt now, however much the truth had dawned on her, it was too late. The damage was irreversible. Without a word, she gave a slight nod and turned to go upstairs. I stood there watching her leave, feeling a hollow emptiness and coldness inside my chest. This was the end for us. Not the way I had imagined, but a reality I had to face. When her footsteps faded, I turned and walked out of the house, stepping into the cool night air. Joseph was standing by his car, pale and wide-eyed. It looked like he wanted to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I walked past him without a glance, got into my car, and drove off. This was no longer about Sarah or Joseph. It was about me, about reclaiming myself, about finding my way forward. I had carried this burden for too long, and now it was time to let it go. As I drove through the quiet night, the road stretching ahead, one thing became clear. I was going to be okay. Sarah had tried to break me, to destroy everything we had built together. But here I was, still standing. Now, it was time to start over, to seek something real, something honest, something that couldn't be shattered by lies or betrayal. The next morning, I woke up in a small, unremarkable motel on the outskirts of town. A faint morning light filtered through the thin curtains, and for the first time in a long while I felt a moment of pure, peaceful emptiness. There was no pain, there was no rage, only cold, empty clarity, as if all my emotions had frozen. But then, suddenly, everything crashed down on me all at once. The betrayal, Sarah, Joseph, all of it overwhelmed me, reminding me of the destruction that had turned my life upside down. The room was as cold as my feelings, the chill seeping into my bones. I realized I could no longer stay here. It was time to face the consequences, to deal with what came next. It was over. As I drove back to the house, the silence in the car only intensified the chaos raging in my head. What would I see when I crossed the threshold? Would Sarah be waiting for me, ready for one last confrontation? Or would Joseph be hiding, desperately trying to explain himself? My hands gripped the steering wheel, my fingers turning white as I braced for what awaited me. When I pulled up to the house, the empty spot where Sarah's car should have been caught my eye. She wasn't there. The emptiness echoed in the still morning air, amplifying the void I already felt. The front door was unlocked, and as I stepped inside, the house felt lifeless. It wasn't just Sarah's absence, it was as if the very essence of this home had vanished, as if the memories we shared had been erased overnight. A few of Sarah's belongings remained, boxes by the door filled with clothes, books, and trinkets she hadn't even bothered to take. I didn't look at them. Taking a deep breath, I walked into the living room, and there it was, a note on the coffee table. My name was written in Sarah's familiar handwriting. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to tear it up and throw it away, but curiosity outweighed doubt. I opened the envelope, the sound of tearing paper the only noise breaking the silence. Her neat, precise handwriting filled the page, and I forced myself to read. Richard, I have nothing to say that could make this right. I never wanted to hurt you, but I understand that intentions no longer matter. I thought I could live two lives without causing harm, but now I realize how selfish and wrong that was. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm sorry for the lies, the betrayal, for not having the courage to tell you everything sooner. Maybe one day you'll understand why I did it, even if you never forgive me. Sarah. I crumpled the letter in my hand, barely registering what I had just read. Understand? The audacity of those words made me want to laugh. It wasn't about understanding her reasons or trying to see things from her perspective. It was about the destruction of everything we had built together. And for what? A fleeting thrill? A sharp sensation? I tossed the note onto the table, watching as it fell on top of the boxes Sarah had left behind. That was her apology, just a few empty lines about not wanting to hurt me. A shallow explanation that did nothing to soften the damage she'd done. I turned away from it, deciding not to let her occupy any more space in my thoughts. She was gone, and it was final. With Sarah no longer in the picture, the next steps crashed over me like a tidal wave. I needed to call the lawyer. I had to start unraveling the tangled mess of our life together, finances, property, everything that tied us to each other. The thought of it was exhausting, yet at the same time, I felt like I was reclaiming something, a part of myself I had hidden away for too long. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name of the divorce lawyer someone had recommended. My finger hovered over the call button for a moment, and a tight knot of hesitation gripped my chest. This was it. Once I pressed that button, there would be no going back, no chance for reconciliation, no hope of salvaging what had been broken. But that hope had died the moment Sarah let Joseph into our lives. I pressed the button and brought the phone to my ear. The ringing echoed through the empty house, filling the silence. After a few moments, a clear, professional voice answered, and I began telling my story, my words cold and detached. The lawyer listened attentively, occasionally interrupting with clarifying questions. When I hung up the phone, a wave of relief washed over me. Deep down, I knew I had made the right decision. I couldn't continue drifting along in a life that had already fallen apart beyond recognition. It was time to move on, to start something new, something that would be entirely mine. No more Sarah, no more false promises and betrayals poisoning everything around me. The rest of the day passed in a haze as I packed her things, stuffing clothes into boxes without caring how it looked. I moved through the house on autopilot, focused on one thing only: erasing every trace of her presence. By the time I finished, the living room was filled with neatly labeled boxes. They held the last fragments of a life we had once shared. I called the moving company to arrange the delivery of the boxes to her new place. Sarah hadn't bothered to tell me where she was going, but Margaret had passed along the details. It felt symbolic. Sarah disappearing without a word, leaving me to clean up the mess. That evening, as the last box was loaded onto the truck, I stood in the doorway, watching the taillights fade into the distance. Finally, the house was mine again. The silence that followed seemed to wrap around me. The emptiness left by her absence felt welcoming, ready to embrace whatever was to come. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in weeks, there were no more hidden secrets, no lies waiting to be uncovered. Sarah was gone, but I remained. I was still standing, ready to move forward. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank into the couch, staring out into the night. What once felt like suffocating silence now felt peaceful. The emptiness no longer reminded me of what I had lost, but of what I could build, a life that was entirely mine, shaped by my own choices. My thoughts drifted back to Olivia. I remembered the look in her eyes when we met at the cafe, a mixture of determination and sadness. We had both been betrayed, both left to pick up the pieces of someone else's decisions, but we had survived, and now, perhaps, we could both find a way to build something real, something honest. I took a sip of beer, the cold liquid contrasting with the warmth spreading through my chest. The future was uncertain, but for the first time I wasn't afraid. I wasn't sure if I would ever find love again or even if I wanted to. But I was certain of one thing. I was free. Free from the lies, free from a marriage that had collapsed long before I realized it. And that freedom, that unpredictability no longer made me anxious. It felt like the beginning of something new, something I could build from the ground up. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Not for Sarah or for what we had lost, but for myself, for who I could become, and what kind of life I could create. The path ahead was clear, and I looked forward to seeing where it would lead. The following week, the house began to change along with me. I repainted the walls, got rid of the couch Sarah loved, and replaced it with something sleeker and more modern, something that felt more like me. I bought new dishes, changed the bed linens, and tossed out the old decorative pillows she had chosen. It was a symbolic process, a way to signal that everything we had shared was over. With each change, the house became a little more mine and a little less a reminder of the life we once shared. It was cathartic. I had just finished painting the guest room in a soothing shade of blue when I heard a knock at the door. Wiping my hands on a cloth, I frowned. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that it could be Sarah, returning to stir up more drama. But I quickly dismissed the idea. She was too proud to come back after everything that had happened between us. When I opened the door, it wasn't Sarah standing on the doorstep. It was Joseph. He looked terrible, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept for days. He lingered in the doorway, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on me as though the purpose of his visit had slipped his mind. A wave of anger surged through me, clenching my jaw as I looked at him. This was the man who had stolen Sarah from me, the one who once stood in my home as if he belonged there, with that pitiful look on his face. Joseph. His name finally escaped his lips in a hoarse, tense voice. "Can we talk?" Every instinct in me screamed to slam the door in his face. I wanted to tell him to leave, to never come near my home again. But something in his expression stopped me. There was a vulnerability, a desperation in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. He looked like a man whose life had completely fallen apart. And strangely, part of me was curious to hear him out. I stepped aside, leaving the door barely ajar, just enough for him to come in if he chose. He hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting Sarah to appear at any moment. I led him to the living room, where we stood in thick, suffocating silence. "What do you want, Joseph?" I asked in a cold, detached voice. I had no time for pleasantries or apologies. He swallowed nervously, his Adam's apple bobbing before he finally spoke. "Sarah's gone." His voice trembled, and when he looked at me there was raw pain in his eyes, something that almost made me feel pity. "She left 4 days ago," he continued, his words faltering. "She packed her things and just left. Didn't even say goodbye." I stared at him, my anger now mixed with disbelief. She left? The thought that Sarah, after all the chaos she had caused in our lives, had simply left seemed unreal. "Why are you here, Joseph? Why are you telling me this?" I demanded, my voice sharp and cutting. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, exhaling heavily. "Because I don't know what else to do," he admitted. "She's gone, Richard. She used me just like she used you. I thought she loved me, thought we had a future, but she just left." His voice broke, pain seeping through every word. "She used me to destroy her life, and when the dust settled, she was gone, didn't even look back." I couldn't hold it in any longer. I let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed through the room. "And what do you expect me to say to that, Joseph? You think I'll feel sorry for you? You want me to help you pick up the pieces?" I shook my head, the anger flaring up again, fueled by his audacity, by the fact that he was standing here expecting sympathy. "You destroyed my marriage, Joseph. You walked into my home, stood right in front of me and took what didn't belong to you. And now you're asking for help because she did the same to you?" He flinched at my words, his face contorting as if he were on the verge of breaking down. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," he muttered, his voice shaky. "I know I messed everything up, but I needed someone who would understand. She didn't just hurt you, Richard. She hurt me too." I stared at him, my anger still smoldering beneath the surface. But alongside it, something else began to rise. A reluctant acknowledgement. He was right. Sarah had manipulated us both, using us to fill whatever void she had inside. And when she was done, she discarded us without a second thought, leaving nothing but destruction in her wake. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. The tension in my shoulders began to ease, and the weight gradually lifted. "What did you expect, Joseph?" I asked, my tone still sharp, but now tinged with sympathy. "Did you really believe she would change for you? That she would somehow become someone else?" His head dropped, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I guess I thought we were different, that maybe she really loved me." I sighed heavily and ran my hand over my face, the exhaustion of the past week weighing on me. "Sarah doesn't really love anyone, not in the way you want her to," I replied, my voice full of harsh reality. "She loves being adored. She loves the excitement, the chase. But once she gets what she wants, her interest fades, and she moves on. That's who she is." He looked up, his eyes filled with the sadness I knew all too well. "What do I do now?" he asked quietly. "How do I move on after all this? She took all our savings and left." I looked at him, at the man who had once been my rival, the one who had helped tear my life apart. But now, looking at him, I no longer saw an enemy. He was just another victim of Sarah's selfishness, another person left to deal with the aftermath of her destructive actions. "You recover," I finally said, my voice weary. "You start over. You learn from this, and you don't let it define you. You move forward, Joseph. It's the only thing you can do. He nodded, tears welling up in his eyes, but he held them back. I'm sorry, Richard, he said, his voice trembling. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I truly am sorry. I wish I could take it all back. I just nodded, though I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Maybe one day I would be able to forgive him. Maybe the anger would fade, and I'd see him as just another victim of Sarah's manipulation. But today was not that day. It's time for you to go, I said, stepping back and holding the door open for him. He nodded again, wiping his eyes, and left without saying another word. The door quietly clicked shut behind him. I stood there, letting the silence settle. Something inside me had shifted. Joseph's visit had stirred old wounds, brought up pain I thought I had buried. And yet, strangely, it also brought something else. Closure I hadn't expected. Sarah was gone, and with her went the power she had over both Joseph and me. I returned to the living room, looking over the changes I had made, the new beginning I had carved out for myself. In that moment, I realized I no longer needed anything from Sarah, not her apologies, not her explanations, not even her regrets. I was finally free, and for the first time, I felt that freedom. As days turned into weeks, life slowed down, and I was able to appreciate it at last. For the first time in years, I no longer waited for the next disaster, the next betrayal, or the exhausting struggle to maintain a doomed relationship. Now, I could focus on my life, free from the past and Sarah's shadow. I started doing small things for myself, things I hadn't done in what felt like forever. I picked up a book and went to the park, sitting under the shade of a sturdy oak, losing myself in stories that didn't reflect my own life. I went to the gym more often, running until my heart pounded, feeling alive, but no longer from bitterness or grief. I reconnected with old friends, people I had drifted away from when Sarah's chaos consumed my life. They welcomed me back without hesitation, without judgment. It felt like a breath of fresh air after breathing smoke for so long. The house was changing, just like me. I took down the old photos of Sarah and me and replaced them with bright, bold paintings. These new abstract pieces, filled with rich colors, symbolized a future with endless possibilities, not the life that had passed. I transformed the guest room into a small art studio, set up an easel, and started painting again, a hobby I hadn't pursued since my college days. It was far from perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. One quiet day, as I was relaxing in the living room with a cup of coffee, the sun's rays filtering through the curtains, my phone vibrated. Expecting a message from a friend or work, I glanced quickly at the screen. To my surprise, it was from Olivia. Hey, Richard. I was just thinking, would you like to grab a coffee sometime, just to talk? I stared at the message, and slowly, a smile spread across my face. Olivia and I hadn't spoken in a few weeks, but she had been on my mind every day. Our last conversation and the shared understanding we found through our mutual grief had stayed with me. This wasn't the kind of connection you see in romantic comedies. It was deeper, real. We had both been through our personal battles and emerged on the other side, stronger and more whole. Without hesitation, I typed back, I'd love to. How about this weekend? Her reply was instant and simple. Sounds great. A small message that filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. It was amazing how a simple text could make me feel like I was truly moving forward. By Saturday, I suddenly felt nervous. This wasn't a date, I reminded myself. Just coffee. Two people, both healing from similar wounds, seeking comfort in each other's company. Yet, standing in front of the mirror, adjusting my shirt, I realized this meeting was more important to me than I was willing to admit. We met at a cozy cafe downtown. The place had mismatched chairs and a friendly, homely atmosphere. Olivia was already seated at a table in the corner, cradling a mug in her hands. When she looked up and saw me, A soft smile appeared on her lips. "Richard," she said, her voice light, almost relieved. "I'm so glad you came." I smiled back and sat across from her. "Of course, it's great to see you, Olivia." We started with the usual topics: work, hobbies, books we were reading. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and before long I found myself laughing for the first time in months. Olivia's dry sense of humor, which I hadn't fully appreciated before, made me smile, and her eyes lit up when she talked about what she loved: cooking, hiking, and the painting classes she had recently started attending. Eventually, the conversation shifted, as it always did, to Sarah and Joseph. But this time, it didn't hurt. It felt more like discussing a chapter from a distant past, something that no longer weighed us down. "How are you holding up?" Olivia asked, her eyes warm and attentive as she looked at me. I thought for a moment before nodding, a slight smile touching my lips. "I'm good. Better than good, actually. It's strange, but I feel free, for the first time in a long time." Her expression softened, and she smiled in return. "Me too. It's like I can finally breathe, you know? It still hurts, but it's different now. I'm not carrying it with me everywhere anymore." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee, content in the shared understanding that the hardest part of our journey was behind us. I fully immersed myself in the moment, content with simply existing. As I glanced at Olivia, a thought crossed my mind. Perhaps this is what true healing looks like. It doesn't come as a sudden revelation or a burst of joy, but rather through these quiet, wordless moments shared with someone who genuinely understands. Olivia broke the silence, her voice soft but uncertain. "Richard," she began cautiously, "have you ever thought about what comes next?" Her question lingered between us, and I sensed a deeper meaning hidden in her words. I reached out, my fingers barely brushing hers in a small but significant gesture. Despite its simplicity, there was something more, a quiet confidence. "Honestly, I don't know what lies ahead," I admitted, letting the words hang in the air. "But I think I want to find out, step by step." She responded with a gentle smile, her fingers wrapping around mine. In that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, something solid and true. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one I could write on my own terms. We stayed there for the rest of the day, talking, laughing, sharing stories, until the sky began to blush with the soft hues of sunset. As the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in shades of pink and orange, I walked her to her car. Before getting in, she turned to me, her expression calm. "Richard," she said quietly, "I'm glad we're doing this together." Warmth spread through my chest, and I smiled in return. "I am too, Olivia." Sarah left our marriage with 20% of our savings. Joseph wasn't a wealthy man, and maybe when he couldn't afford the luxurious life Sarah was used to, she ran away. 15 months had passed since Sarah left, and now here she stood at my house begging for forgiveness. "Richard, I was so wrong. I'm back. I only want to be with you. I'm tired of living this way." My laughter filled the air around us. "Are you kidding, Sarah? It's been over for a long time. Go away." "I have nowhere to go. Our children have driven me away. They refuse to shelter their own mother." I didn't listen to her any further, knowing she was playing her game again. I closed the door in her face. For a while she knocked and begged for forgiveness, but I turned on my favorite show and lost myself in it. I stood there for a moment, watching as her taillights disappeared into the distance. The evening air was cool, and as the sky darkened, I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. Sarah had tried to break me, to destroy everything I was, leaving me hollow, but she failed. I'm still here, I'm still standing, and I'm ready to move forward. The past is behind me, and whatever the future holds, I'll shape it myself. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly free. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, Then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.